At the end of the Middle Kingdom, there's a period of chaos and turbulence. The pharaohs lose control of Egypt, and in the north, Egypt is invaded. And this ushers in a new period, the New Kingdom, when the pharaohs regain control and restore political and economic strength to Egypt. Throughout our discussions of ancient Egypt, we've been using the term pharaoh almost interchangeably with king or ruler. But the term pharaoh is actually a New Kingdom term. And Thutmose III, who reigned between 1479 and 1425, was the first to adopt this term. And the term pharaoh means great house. During the New Kingdom, the pharaohs undertook great building programs in which they built palaces and forts and administrative centers, and of course, lots of temples and tombs. There was particularly a lot of new temples built at this time during the New Kingdom, as the new pharaohs shifted worship to not new gods, but different gods. Gods that, they had always been around, but the focus was on different gods at different times. And the gods that were particularly worshipped in this moment were Amun-Re, his wife Mut, and Montu. With these new pharaohs, we also see the shifting of the seat of power from Lower Egypt, where, remember, we were looking at Gizeh when we were talking about the Old Kingdom, down to Upper Egypt, particularly Thebes. And two massive temples that were built at this time were Karnak and Luxor. The massive temple complex of Karnak was the principal religious center of the god Amun-Re in Thebes during the New Kingdom, which lasted from 1550 until 1070 BCE. And this remains one of the largest religious complexes in the world. But Karnak was not just one temple dedicated to one god. It actually was a complex that included temples to and precincts to the gods Mut and Montu. Compared to other temple compounds that survive in ancient Egypt, Karnak is in poor state of preservation, and you can see that it really is in ruins in part of the complex. But from this view, you can see some of the main features, particularly these massive gates, these walled gates that are called pylons, and the hypostyle hall, which is right behind it, with columns that still exist, these massive columns. And then over here, we see the sacred lake. Amun-Re was a principal god of ancient Egypt. This particular deity was a composite of the god Amun, who is the patron saint of Thebes, and the sun god, Re. Mut was a primordial goddess associated with motherhood, and she was the wife of Amun-Re. She was sometimes referred to as the mother of earth and sometimes as the mother of gods. Montu was the ancient Egyptian god of war and is sometimes depicted with the head of a falcon or a bull. Here's a model of what Karnak might have looked like. Again, you'll recognize those pylons, those massive walled gates that you walk through in sort of a procession. You would walk past sculptures that are a series of sphinxes, representations of the pharaoh. When you moved inside, you'd move to this hypostyle hall, which has a series of columns. And we'll look at those columns in a moment. And you can see beyond here the sacred lake. When you visited the temple. Inside would be a massive deity representing Amun-Re himself. This would be a place where priests would attend to the god, clothing him and making offerings and washing him daily. He would be bathed from the water coming from the sacred lake. Here is an aerial view where you can see really the grand scale of this building project. But we can also see how the precinct of Amun-Re takes up the majority of the space and is flanked on either side by the precinct of Mut and the precinct of Mantu. One of the greatest marvels of Karnak is the hypostyle hall that was built during the Ramsidi period. And a hypostyle hall, and I think we've discussed this before, is a space with a roof supported by columns. This hall has 134 massive sandstone columns, with the center 12 of them, and these are the center columns, measuring 69 feet tall. Like most of the temple decoration, the hall would have been brightly painted. So here we're looking at low relief that is covering these columns with hieroglyphs and figures. They would have also been brightly painted, and some of the paint still exists today on the upper portions of the columns and the ceiling. Now the top, the roof would have been covered with sandstone tiles. So it would have been very dark inside other than torches that were brought in from outside. The light would shine through a series of windows called a clerestory. A clerestory is formed when the center hall is taller than the spaces on the side. And the Egyptians allowed for clerestory lighting to otherwise light a space that would have been very dark. This is a space that would have been very restrictive, and not many ancient Egyptians would have had access to this hall. It would have only really been for the priests and the pharaoh and whoever else was communing with the god sculpture inside. The further you went into the temple, the more restricted access became. And I think you can see that here. As you moved through the temple complex, you were really restricted by these gates, or at least given that visual obstacle. And so it was a very exclusive access to obtain entrance to the hypostyle hall. Here is an artist's reconstruction of what the hypostyle hall might have looked like. And you can see that the taller columns in the center allow for this series of windows called the clerestory, and light, or at least some limited light, would flow in from the clerestory and provide some light on the interior. Conceptually, temples in Egypt were connected to the idea of the first time, or the beginnings of the creation of the world, that origin myth that runs throughout the pantheon of the gods. The temple was meant to be a reflection of this time, when the mound of creation emerged from the primeval waters. The pylons, or those gateways, those heavy gateways that you walked through, represent the horizon. And as one moves further and further into the temple, the floor rises until it reaches the sanctuary of the god, given the impression of a rising mound, like the one during creation. The temple roof represented the sky and was often decorated with stars and birds. The columns were designed with lotus, papyrus, and palm plants in order to reflect the marsh-like environment of the creation. And you can see here how the capitals of especially the center columns look like leaves that are expanding to give this kind of nice floral motif at the top. In the outer areas of Karnak, which was located near the Nile River, it would undoubtedly be annual, and this was a intentional effect, which would allow floodwaters to come into the floor, and it was so ever so slightly angled so that there was just a light film of water on the floor and made you feel like you were walking through those primeval waters of the creation. All of these forms and depictions were intended by the designers to enhance these symbols of the temple and of Amun-Re.